I work as administrator for my spouse's performance company. And so we've done a performance where the preparation for the performance was part of the performance. So there's the backstage and the spectacle, the spectacle. There is no distinction between the two. So I'm quite glad to, you may want to cut this out, but I have no problem with you starting recording now.
Cool. Well, I have started recording, and I think that's a pretty neat idea that I think we can certainly give a go.
Okay.
So yeah, I suppose a bit of context. So we've been in contact for a few days now, having little backs and forth. Of course, yeah, we read your paper, and I also tried to read a little bit about the background also of the association and all your kind of activities and the scope of Castoriadis's work. It's certainly, yeah, for someone who's, getting acquainted with these ideas and writings for the first time, it's somewhat, well, daunting to think, well, I suppose the aim is not for us to have an even level conversation, at least in terms of the content of the whole of Castoriadis' oeuvre, but well, yeah, I personally am just kind of a budding translator. I'm relatively young, 29, but I have a little bit of a taste also in terms of I get the sense that it's this work is very much connected to kind of what you could call a personal project or this reflexive process of finding both the concepts and the praxis and how that evolves and your notion of agency involves and also with relation to the work itself and how it is transformative and the process of creating and putting it out there in the public domain.
If I could just reply in relation to that, I've always felt it's very important to make it clear I don't talk about myself as an expert about this, and to the extent that we would get into questions of, because it's an integral part of the paper of being a translator and what that means, you have as much, you have an experience too. So actually we're on an equal footing as far as that is concerned. And for me, anyone who talks about Castoriadian as a title or as a concept, I think misses the point of what Castoriadis is talking about. And so I'm interested in having an exchange where to the extent that I've been able to communicate something, then you will be able to articulate it too. And it won't be something that is, I've got all of this knowledge and then other people are supposed to just absorb that or something along those lines.
We also, at least I saw maybe an opportunity for our specific talk to kind of leverage both that, David, you're here, and Michelle, you also have, kind of are known for a kind of, could call it a theory of social change. And kind of institutions and the principles behind them. And I think there could be an interesting back and forth, not, as a conduit of Castoriadis per se, but in relation to his work and, well, your overview of what's out there in terms of tools to tinker around these ideas or to understand them at different levels or understand to approach them at different levels.
One thing I can say in relation to that is that I don't think that Castoriadis would have thought of himself as a theorist of social change. We're already getting into some of the meat of what this is about. He did not think there was what he was interested in was elucidating people's own capacities for change. And so when he's talking, he's not developing a theory that then is applied as something separate, but that there is ongoing creative activity in the world. And then we get into questions of autonomy and heteronomy and so on. But he was trying to be someone elucidating, as opposed to, for example, a Leninist point of view, where there's a substitutionism, where you have a cadre of people who have the view of the necessity of historical materialism or whatever, that would tell people how they either must act or should act based upon some reading that a relatively small group of people would have. His whole life was responding and reacting to that sort of view of, so I have a little trouble with the idea that we would be doing a typology of social change or something along those lines. He even had an article in the early 50s, before he was known as, in relation to creativity and imagination, talking about the proletariat as a cosmogonic force. So he was talking about not having a theory that would control or would tell people what to do, but to help people in elucidating what they are actually going through.
Okay, so I'm not assuming that all our readers and listeners will have like an idea who Castoriadis is. So I'm just gonna give a small summary of what I think like the phase in his life were, and then maybe you can react to that and give some more texture. So the way I understand it, he was a revolutionary, first engaged with in supporting the Russian Revolution, who then started having doubts and became more of a Trotskyist. So that might be then the second phase, but then he moved to France and created a group called Socialisme et Barbarie, where he really went into a very in-depth analysis of the Soviet system and why it went wrong, and then subsequently, in that phase, I only read one book, which is The Imaginary Institution of Society, and then he kind of engaged more with the capitalist system as it was evolving after the 60s, and how he created a new type of human being that was consumerist, and so there was a loss of meaning, and what was the word he used? Insignificance. Right. So can you tell a bit more about his evolution, and then maybe how you got involved and engaged with that body of work?
Well, he was a quite remarkable person that I had the opportunity to know the last 13 years of his life and to work with him. He was at the age of 12 or 13 already reading philosophy, and very quickly came upon Marx, and also this was a time, born in 1922, so this was in the 30s, which was a very important time in history with a lot going on. And so he joined, I believe around age 15, the Communist Party youth wing, and discovered very quickly the sort of chauvinist character of what was the Greek Communist Party at the time. So by soon thereafter, he created already an opposition group within the Communist Party, and then from there joined the most left wing of the Trotskyist groups, which meant that he could have been killed by either the Germans under the occupation, or the communists, or just right-wing forces within the country.
He was really in history, he was engaged with the struggles of his time.
Yes, and an important event was actually when the communists tried to take over in 44. He already had an analysis that he had been able to discover that the quote unquote Soviet Union, he never used that term, he always spoke of it as Russia. He had discovered what would be in store for Greece that was in store for the rest of Eastern Europe. And so he was taking this position that developed as that this was a new class that had developed in Russia. And that while he toyed a little bit in France with the idea of a third solution, he came up with the concept of bureaucratic capitalism that would apply both to the Russian totalitarian system and in a more fragmented way, as he said later, with the West, that no longer was it possible for just some owners of capital to run things. There was an entire bureaucratic system that had developed. And within that, he showed that there was a class distinction between directors and executants, order givers and order takers, as the London Solidarity spoke about. So it's not just the possessing and the dispossessed as the class division. There's an entire new system that was being perfected in Russia, but also was developing in a more organic way, so that there was a capitalism on both sides of what became the Iron Curtain. Greece ended up in the West, but he saw what was coming in Eastern Europe really before it was actually realized in the early post-war period.
Right.
And because the Trotskyists, when he got to France and joined the Trotskyist group there, were still under the idea that there had to be an unconditional defense of the USSR. That's where the break was with the Trotskyists, and they formed their own group called Socialisme ou Barbarie, Socialism or Barbarism.
Which is a group that created an enormous number of French intellectuals, isn't it? Like a lot of people who became famous afterwards actually came from that little, it must have been an enormously creative group.
Well, this would get the dander up, the anger of the people that were in the group. And this is something that a point that has been made. It was a revolutionary group, and it brought together a number of people, some of whom became famous later as intellectuals. Claude Lafleur, who was the co-founder of the group, Jean-Francois Lyotard, I believe it was Laplanche, who was a psychoanalyst who was there, other people. So it has this posthumous aura as this group of intellectuals. But what it was committed to was, at the time, proletarian revolution, but in a completely new way of conceiving what that might be. So it's one should be careful not to backdate it as a group of intellectuals.
Yeah. So how did you get engaged, David, with Castoriadis? Because it became like the guiding work in your life, right? Translating 1 million words, which is
I beg your pardon?
You translated 1 million words, which sounds like mind-boggling in volume.
Yeah. Also, well, somewhat with the help of Maurice Brinton, which is the pseudonym for the pen name for Christopher Palace. So I did some editing as well as my own translating. But yes, about a million words. My background is during the pandemic. I'm here in Winchester, Massachusetts, which is a somewhat wealthy suburb of Boston. And my interest was first in philosophy, like Castoriadis, about the same age, and became interested in political activities a little bit later, like him. I studied philosophy at Harvard, but I also took time off and was doing civil rights organizing down south when I was 19. And then after graduation from the Harvard Philosophy Department, which was for me pure torture. They were into analytical philosophy and nothing else. I was doing multiracial community organizing with Carolina Action, which was then affiliated and merged with ACORN, Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now. I have always been someone believing in direct democracy, and I found that there was a bureaucracy in these organizations. So at several points, I organized staff rebellions against the hierarchy of these organizations, which, as it turns out, usually control enough of the means of funding and so on that those rebellions are crushed. So I went to back to Yale, where I had studied a little bit and got a job in the Afro-American Studies department, working with Henry Louis Gates Jr., who was sort of Mr. Black Studies in the United States. We found rediscovered the first novel ever published by a African-American woman, 1859. And so I worked with him, but I had a desire to continue on both philosophy and politics. While I was at Yale, I was doing feminist labor organizing, the issue of comparable work, that women for the same sort of work were being paid much less, the whole pink collar phenomenon, secretary. Right. So I was involved with a very grassroots movement at Yale in labor organizing. But I also was continuing to read philosophy, and I had received a book on the intellectual origins of May 68, written by Arthur Hirsch. And he talked about Sartre and subsidiarily Andre Gortz, and also Henri Lefebvre and the Situationists. Right. And then this bizarre man named Cornelius Castoriadis and this obscure group called Socialisme ou Barbarie that I had never heard of. And I became very interested in this, that all of my extremely frustrating philosophy studies at Harvard had not given me access to this. And even when I was reading Merleau-Ponty, I wasn't understanding that behind Merleau-Ponty, there was his student, Claude Lefort, who was actually one of the co-founders of Socialisme ou Barbarie. So I actually wrote to Castoriadis and told him that I was interested in translating his work, and that with my spouse, who had done her studies as a high school student in France, we were coming to France, and he was completely open to this. I had to explain to him that because I was on strike at the time, and this was back in 1984, you had the computer terminal and the keyboard in one place, and you had to walk 10 minutes to another building for the printer. Right. Very different than these days. And because I was on strike and couldn't cross the picket line, I explained to Castoriadis that I had translated him, but I didn't have any access to the translation. And he was very generous and open and invited us to come to visit him. And that's how I met him in early January of 1985. And knowing absolutely nothing about the publishing world, I wrote to 43 different publishers, and one of them said yes. And that was the University of Minnesota Press, that had published a small excerpt from the then unpublished English language translation of The Imaginary Institution of Society. And that's how I began working with him for the last 13 years of his life.
Okay. So maybe just to continue a bit the chronology. So, first his focus was on Russia and how that went evolved in a bad way, and then he started dealing with the specific issues of capitalism, and this idea of insignificance. Can you say a bit more about how how his thought
Sure.
evolved. Yeah, and maybe also because the notion of autonomy, I think, is interesting for people now.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
it's a very strong theme today.
Hmm.
You know, it's kind of more horizontalist vision of the world, and
Hmm.
it's all about agency and, you know, non-hierarchy. So I think his work might get like a second life now because of, you know, how people are evolving in that direction.
Hmm. Well, one distinction to maybe not be made is between Russia on the one hand and capitalism on the other. That for Castoriadis, Russia was a bureaucratic capitalist country, and the foremost of the bureaucratic capitalist countries. And when Socialisme Barbarie was formed in 48, 46 as a tendency within the Fourth International, the Trotskyists, and then 48, 49 as a group that started to publish its own review. The idea was that there was a world system that was divided, but was bureaucratic capitalist on both sides of what became the Iron Curtain. So he was already concerned, and he was trying to figure out how to show how the Communist Party was in France and elsewhere in the West was keeping workers from being able to develop what for him was his idea of socialism, which was autonomous worker self-management or workers management. Self-management already existed at the time with Yugoslavia, which was this combination of making workers responsible at a local level, at the same time having Tito's police state. So autogestion, self-management at the time, was not really the term they used, but they were trying to figure out what was a world system functioning and what was needed to, on the level of theory and critique, to point to a different way for workers to not create a system like Russia in the West, and looking at ways in which people in the West and in the East were coming up against that bureaucracy and were, by the very nature of what they were experiencing, were developing the premises and the actions and the organizations that would be challenging that worldwide system. And that came to a head in 1956 with the Hungarian Revolution, where what Socialisme Barbarie had been predicting 7 years earlier, that there would be a workers' revolt against the bureaucracy, actually took place in Hungary. Now, that was for Socialisme Barbarie a period that was starting to get some interest from the French public, because no one was talking about the group. It was very small. It was publishing its review, but there was basically a conspiracy of silence. Sartre, even though Claude Lefort was writing for L'Étoile Moderne and was there as the protege of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was the political editor of L'Étoile Moderne, there was no talk really about Socialisme Barbarie. After 56, Communist Party being basically torn asunder by the Hungarian Revolution, there was an interest, and so there was this period where, as Castoriadis jokingly said, if everyone who was with us, who said they were with us, we would have taken power somewhere around 1957. Though, you know, retrospectively, people are thinking, oh, it's this group of intellectuals, but they were having this influence and so on. It was actually a very small group, but with some very big ideas. And so there was this period where it looked like there was a greater audience, but also very quickly, 58, there was the permanent coup d'etat, as Francois Mitterrand said, of de Gaulle coming in, and it would mean actually the workers having very large cuts in their income, and it was on the backs of the workers that de Gaulle really came to power. And there was not a reaction that one would have predicted using the ideas of Socialisme Barbarie or just in general. Socialisme Barbarie said, this is not return to fascism. De Gaulle is not the new Hitler or a strong man. This is the modernization of capitalism. And it was borne out later on that's exactly what was happening. But it raised some really big questions about privatization in society, which gets to this second part with the rising tide of insignificancy. And but already in '59, Castoriadis was talking about, in Modern Capitalism and Revolution, his big text published in Socialisme Barbarie from that period, that he was noticing that there was a withdrawal from the organizations that had been built by the working class. The Communist Party was not what it was before. Labor unions were also bureaucratic organizations, pretty much integrated into the system.
Right.
And because of that, people were withdrawing from those organizations, and we were creating a situation where people were looking to their private life a more individualistic way.
So would you agree with me that the difference between working class culture and middle class culture is exactly that? Which means if you're a worker, you look for your advancement collectively because you can't do it on your own. And once you start believing that you can use your own merit and work to advance, then that's when you're middle class, because you can project yourself on your individual career, and you believe you can do this, without needing other people. Would you agree with that? Or
the danger would be thinking of it in terms of mindsets, simply. The reality is that anyone that is working in a bureaucratically organized organization is subject to this directors and executants, order takers, order givers division. Also, as he said later, it becomes more complicated because most people are playing some role that's a little bit of both, or at different times, one or the other. But that is a social experience. It's not just a mindset that people once were collective and now have become individualistic. There is the bureaucratization of basically all of social life that starts out in the workplace and then expands to a bureaucratization of leisure activities, bureaucratization of most institutions, and people are turned off by that. But they're also still facing every day in work that they've got a boss. They've got irrational orders that they're expected to carry out. If you've got a managerial class, you've got people that are planning. They're planning on the basis of what they put down on paper to tell you what you should be doing with your life. And so people are then faced with the fact that they're not going to get paid, especially if it's piecework, for doing the work if they don't actually fill in all of the holes in the plan. And there's informal organization within the workplace that is a counter organization to the bureaucratic planning that is supposed to foresee everything. And these bureaucrats and managers wouldn't have a raison d'etre if they weren't telling other people what to do. But at the same time, and here we get to autonomy, people are forming informal organizations to fill in all of the holes in the plan, to speak
Right.
very, very generally. And so a counter organization is created. Now, can that informal counter organization be brought to the level of changing the way society overall is? That's always been and always will be, I think, the question. Where present day society is continuing to create the desire and the practices of autonomy. But at the same time, the system that we have always has to discourage the participation that it also schizophrenically is soliciting.
Right.
Have
So
that.
So would you agree also that, you know, when he, I don't know, like time-wise, what we're talking about, but I mean, you know, there's like post-Fordism and, you know, societies of control, so all these kind of cognitive capitalism, at least for people, I think like me and Rock, we are in a bit of a different situation because we're, you know, even when we work for companies and consultants, we like we have to internalize a lot more than workers 30 years ago. Like there are limits and there are directions, but there's a lot less direct ordering than there used to be, at least for, you know, this particular segment. And then the other change I see is that, you know, from mass media and everybody watching TV to, you know, this kind of fragmentation on the internet, and everybody has his own little tribe and we're not talking to each other anymore. So what part of it did he see? Because I would think this kind of starts maybe in 68. You know, these types of changes start, you know, the premises of it would be around that period. So did he have time to write about these changes and or not?
Well,
And please, you know, feel free to give your own thoughts on this, because I'm
Sure.
you know, yeah.
For him, the important overall thing that was going on was that there is, if you can understand capitalism as not just accumulation of capital, but as a unlimited expansion of rational mastery, which is how he characterizes capitalism with these new views that I've been talking about, and an autonomy project that is running counter to that. The unlimited expansion of rational mastery is a pseudo mastery and a pseudo rationalization, he argues. He did not accept a Weberian conception of rationality. He says that this distinction between the planners and those who are supposed to carry out the plans are there's this attempt to have unlimited control, but at the same time, you're trying to solicit participation of people. Now, there has been some flattening of the bureaucracy. There has been even more of this trying to bring out people's own self-organizational tendencies to make a system that is still a bureaucratic capitalist system run. But you have the basic contrast between the unlimited expansion and, on the other hand, autonomy, which is self-limitation. It's giving yourself your own laws. It's running your own life, and that's individually and collectively. So there's the unlimited and there's the self-limited as this basic contrast. Now, how much things have changed, there's obviously been a lot of attempts to control things in this unlimited expansion of rational mastery. You find today, for example, in the control of information. Information is now the important thing, and we are all basically the products with Facebook and other sorts of social media, where capitalism is still effective and still there as this trying to control and to basically data mine our lives, our minds, our existence. So it is a lot more complicated. That's true. What I've been trying to do is to bring back these terms of analysis or elucidation in such a way that people can think about their lives today. Not to have a final word that, oh, this is how it all works or something like that, because that is not useful beyond what people are actually living and what they're actually struggling about.
So maybe you can say something about this imaginary institution of society. You know, what is meant by that is you know, because what Marxism did was give us like a collective dream, you know, and gave us an idea of where we were going. and that's kind of disappeared. There's a lot of fragmentation now in narratives, and so how does it work now? I mean, how do you see anything, evolving for the better?
Mhm.
With better, I mean not destroying the planet and not having people on the streets all the time because they don't have enough food or work or how would you define hope in the kind of current moment, if there is any?
Well, first of all, it's interesting that you're talking about historical materialism as a collective dream, because that already is the greatest condemnation
Right,
of a Marxist point of view, right?
of course. Well, I've been there, so
There's something that's being revealed beneath that.
yeah,
One of the many interesting things that reading and engaging with Castoriadis's work and finding that the things that you believed before were not necessarily so is that Castoriadis's argument is that Marxism was fully integrated into the capitalist imaginary. That the economism, the productivism, leaving questions of appropriate technologies. There was in the mainstream of Marxism, there was a pretty clear way in which we were going to get to the promised land. And that is something that, to the extent that one has an ecological sensibility or just a human sensibility, is now totally frightening to think that we were, to the extent that any of us were Marxist, that was what we were thinking. And yes, there was this collective dream. It wasn't imaginary, and for Castoriadis, it was the capitalist imaginary. That there's a reason that that Russia was a totalitarian, bureaucratic capitalist country. So that's a first aspect of this. Now, say a little bit more what you were thinking comes after that.
what I'm trying to tease out of you is like, how can we imagine change today? Like, where is the basis for any collective or individual change? And so what we do, me and Rock, and we're the P2P Foundation, is this idea of the commons. As a human institution that we can create. And so this is my idea. I don't know if Rock agrees with this, but the idea, as long as you're between capital and labor, you're fighting within the system. But once you say, I'm a commoner, and we're co-creating something new, then you're already kind of half out of the system, because then you have an imaginary of where you want to go, and you try to instantiate it, alone or with a group of people, and so the kind of on an energetic basis, the idea is that as long as you fight something, you give it energy, right? And at some point you just say, no, that's not where I'm at. I'm divorcing, that part, that I'm really, going another direction. But that's just what we try to do. But I'm interested.
Well, let me connect that to the imaginary. First of all, for Castoriadis, the imaginary is not just the individual imagination of what he calls the singular psyche. There's also a social imaginary. Now, can one just disconnect from that? And there's the phone, which I hope my spouse will, there we go. The social imaginary is not something that can just be disconnected just like that, because these are not just our ideas, but these are our practices, these are our social relations that have been instituted. Now, Castoriadis is talking about instituted society, but also instituting society, that as opposed to Marxism and Hegelianism with a determinism at its basis, there is creativity and there is change. That doesn't mean that there's good change. And
Yeah.
the rising tide of insignificancy as a theme is to talk about all the ways in which there is being created through the continued bureaucratization of society and the destruction of meaning, which begins in work, where the rationalization of the labor process turns into something that people don't have any view of, don't have any control over, and that bureaucratization as a destruction of meaning in work extends with the bureaucratization of all of society to all aspects of society. Now, can you just disconnect that by saying that we're going to have something different? Well, you have to have practices. You have to have social practices to make that happen. And that's, I think, what you were talking about. But is there an idea of creation of new organizations? For Castoriadis, that's really the key, that at moments of revolution, at moments of contestation of established society, new institutions, new significations are created. Now, in our tradition, which tradition shouldn't be taken just as a conservative sort of thing, but in what he calls the Greco-Western historical tradition, at various points in history, there are creation of new forms of organization, new significations for what is meaningful for people in society, and those have a strong democratic component. Whether you're talking about ancient Greece, even with all of the problems about women and slaves being excluded, or the early medieval cities that were trying to define themselves at a distance from both the prince and the church, and becoming organizing and self-ruling on at least a local municipal level. To what extent is just an idea of the commons a creation of new form of organization that has a strong democratic component?
Right.
That would be, for me, my question for you, because I'm not familiar with.
Well, I do think that's the case. So what we see is that there is something new, which is digital self-organization. And so that people are using this to organize things that they couldn't easily organize before. And so you have, on the one hand, the open source communities that have sprung up in the last 20 years, which decide to make different infrastructures and that they're shared, and they have their own autonomous practices and particular set of way of organizing themselves. Then you have the whole field of urban commoning, where people who want healthy food or renewable energy or shared housing and shared mobility are no longer waiting for the market or the state to do this, but saying, okay, how can we do this? And so there's a whole explosion there. It's about tenfold growth in 10 years in that particular field. And then what I'm looking at now, and which is a bit more troubling or complicated to analyze from a progressive point of view, is this whole thing about the blockchain communities, and they're creating their own cryptocurrencies, but they don't believe in democracy as we used to understand, which is about people talking to each other. So they're trying to find these automated incentive systems, and they're capitalists in one hand because they all see themselves as engaging in markets, but they also don't want big companies, they don't want banks. So it's a particular and kind of puzzling way, but it's very strong because it's a very strong ideology in the in technology classes, which are very important for the reproduction of the system today. The coders, the developers, all the people, kind of a labor aristocracy today, because they earn pretty good salaries, and they're really there's no company that can do without them, right? And that gives them a lot of power. And so that's very interesting to observe, but it's outside of the categories that as a progressive person you usually think in. They are seeking their liberation in a kind of different tension than we're used to.
Well, there is this key issue of the creation of new organizational forms that are.
But that's certainly the
democratic.
case. No, that is certainly the case.
What's interesting is that if we can take a broader view, we are definitely living in a technological world that didn't exist at the time that Castoriadis was writing. He died in '97, just as it was
just started.
becoming
It just
something that
started.
you could have
Yeah.
a dial-up internet account. He lived long enough that I worked with him to set up the Agora International
Right.
website.
So 93 is the beginning of the browser and the web.
Yeah, I got
but
on
bef-
in
yeah.
96 and then worked with Castoriadis. And
Right.
I wanted a web page for Agora International for bibliography. And we went to the established institutions in France and they said, well, if we give you a web page for Castoriadis, and sort of understood under this crazy radical who happens to teach at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, we'd have to give a web page to everyone. So that was the head that that the established bureaucratic institutions were at the time. But what I'm saying about taking a step back, we have, and you're talking about fragmentation, we have what we saw with January 6th in the United States and all of the conspiracy theories and Q and Facebook, all of that happening. And then we have basically these techno bros, which have, as far as I can see, mostly a libertarian in the Americas.
But that's what I was talking about in these blockchain communities, right?
Understanding.
Yeah.
And Ronald Reagan said in his neoliberal point of view, the problem with government is that the problem with socialism is you eventually run out of other people's money. The answer for libertarianism in its American view, because there's also London Solidarity, the sister organization of Socialism, called itself Libertarian Socialist, and I try to explain that to Americans, and their head explodes. But the problem with libertarianism in its American incarnation is that eventually you run out of other people's lives. Right.
Yeah.
I read that somewhere online. So we're all bathed in this world. Now, Castoriadis was actually very interested in the possibilities of what became the internet. Already in 1957, he was working his day job at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and eventually had a very high role there with growth studies, national statistics, and so on. And so he was aware of the possibilities of computer technologies, and built into his 1957 On the Contents of Socialism text was an idea of using computers to turn into information that could be handled a self-managed society. So he was
that's
already
pretty much what we are doing, actually. We look at this at the potential for free mutual coordination, and so not central planning, but open systems where everybody can see what all the others are doing, and so can adapt their behavior, but also with kind of inbuilt boundaries that protect the planet, right? So that you can take productive decisions within objective limits of nature, and there you have to have some coercive mechanism or voluntary maybe, but so you're free, but within the frame that you can't destroy the planet, basically, right? And
but
so we look at
the question is, where is the political moment in that?
Where's the political?
Where is the political moment in that?
Right.
That would be the question that I would raise. And ever since really 56 and the Hungarian Revolution exposing what Russia really was as this bureaucratic totalitarian organization, people have come up with ideas of, oh, well, we can't be centralized. That's what was the problem with Russia and communism. And so we have to have something that's decentralized. And there's quite respectable ecological socialist thinkers like Murray Bookchin, who have tried to develop that with municipal libertarianism, or he's had various names for it, but Castoriadis challenged him on this in some articles in the 1970s. And he raised the question of what sort of technology world do we live in? Is it really possible to have just these local communities that are somehow also going to confederate without a political moment that is going to be central? He believed that.
So are you talking about revolution and about actually challenging power directly in a particular moment? Is that what you're saying?
I'm talking about within the context that the social imaginary is not just ideas in the head,
right?
And it's not just feelings of individual people, but it is a whole set of institutions and values and practices. Okay, so we are in a world where the technology has a heavy influence on, and even influence isn't the right word. We're living in a technological society that has many alienating and destructive aspects, and also ecologically. If we're putting all of our lives up into this cloud that isn't a cloud, but is in fact, to talk like a materialist.
It's a private cloud.
It's not only a private cloud. It's also a world where there's a lot of whirring machines in large buildings that are eating up a lot of energy.
A lot of energy.
All of that. So is that what's real, or is it that we're creating something decentralized using existing technologies and thinking that we're going to come out with a different outcome?
Right.
That would be the question.
Yeah. We won't have time to discuss this in details, but that's the kind of thing we try to find answers to, right? This is the kind of work that we do.
And what I'm trying to do is help out people to benefit from someone who remained a revolutionary his entire life, that did not go in for the neoliberal ideology, which as I try, one of the key things I try to show in my paper is that this is an ideology, that both Marxism and liberalism are 19th century ideologies that have had an afterlife all the way into the 20th century, and neither of them is capable of understanding what a social imaginary is. That's Castoriadis's main point. And so we are on a ideological level, on a level of social imaginaries, in the middle of a struggle. Whether we want to say that we're going to opt out of it or not, it's the struggle within a technological society that the question is there still room? Is there still possibility for the creation of new forms of organization that would be democratic? And if they're democratic, can you have socialism in one country? We saw that didn't work. Can we have socialism in a series of municipal or whatever word you would substitute for socialism, cooperative, communal, local organizations that somehow are going to, well, I'm not sure what they're going to do, because there's still the state, there's still there's still the bureaucratic way in which most things are produced. Even if you've got a different way of putting people together in relation to that, there are still a lot of
but the question is what's going to happen when a lot of scarcities are going to reemerge? Water, food, rare metals, and so that's kind of where we're going. We're going to a situation where all the things that we take for granted, it's kind of provided easily and automatically, are going to become problematic in a number of years. And so I think one of the big drives is relocalization. So you can see there's an enormous drive of people wanting to do things locally. But the other thing that's happening at the same time is digital self-organization on translocal basis. And then what we're interested in is how these two things come together. And that's what we call cosmolocal. So you do permaculture, you try to change, food provisioning, you have your feet in the mud, but all the way they are learning is actually not from the people next door, but that's through the networks. And so this is the kind of the model that we're looking at, and that could be another conversation. But like I believe that something new is being born in that kind of cauldron, and that there are new institutions being created. But where exactly this is going to go to, that's still kind of course, an open question. But there is certainly an energy there and an imaginary that is no longer the classic consumerist, capital labor imaginary. It's different. It's a network imaginary, and then it fuses with localism and ecological values. But I think there's a richness to it that is interesting. That
Well, this is something I'm not too familiar with. So the last thing I want to do is trample upon your dreams.
Sure.
The questions that I would ask are to what extent is one relying on some sort of thing coming out of this that is not involving directly the creation of new values and new forms of social organization that have a democratic component. I think it's an illusion to believe that we can just create a lot of local things and that somehow they're going to be acceptable.
Right.
And that
sure, but I completely agree with that. Yes.
Lead to something that we have the same technology, but we're going to somehow get beyond all those bad libertarian in the American sense and come up with something. What seems to be lacking in what you are describing is a political moment in all of this.
Yeah.
Not as something that is supposed to stand over everything.
No, but the problem is today that there is a lot of anti-political feeling.
Yes.
And that's a real problem in these communities. And there's
let me just relate this to what I was talking about before. The two ideologies of the 19th century, which are, if you look at Louis Dumont, you can say this of Marxism as well as liberalism, are individualistic, ultimately, in how they were viewing things, and they are continuing today. So we have still not what we have with still looking in liberal sort of terms. We still have an idea of individuality that doesn't connect to the social imaginary, and with that there is a hatred of politics, and you've just described that. You've just granted that. There is the question of what kind of society do we want? Not we're going to have some sort of blockchain guarantee that everyone's going to behave the way that they should, and there's no place. And in a way, that is the continuation of liberalism in its classical designation, that we can't get all of this political stuff ruining how we're going to save the planet.
Exactly, and there's a strong technocratic philosophy in it, because that actually is a political philosophy from the 1930s. And so you have these people who believe that they can evacuate human complexity by automating smart contracts, and so that's all in there as well. So I think we already over 1 hour, and so maybe Rock, you want to ask some concluding questions before we kind of finalize the conversation?
Sure, thank you. Just a moment. Well, the question of the political moment and the social imaginary kind of got me thinking. also through some movements, concepts, practices that I've been engaging with, and one that also arose from France, but more recently, like décroissance, degrowth, is just one of a few kind of more salient narratives, or kind of meta narratives in their practice that they try to kind of create, or kind of combine or juxtapose different other previous concepts and like relations to any kind of notion of a revolutionary project. And well, one of the mantras in that movement is kind of decolonizing the imaginary, in terms specifically imaginary of continuous growth, economic growth, and economism. But at the same time, with this, looking towards seeds of change, looking towards all these various practices, which are also sometimes, in different places around the world and very contextual and situated, such as Buen Vivir and such. And we've talked to, a couple of guests during this series on, kind of prefigurations or hints or things that people should struggle for as maybe transitional mechanisms, or things that can develop into like political moment proper, like basic income plus basic services, with some ways to go towards a cooperative economy. We've talked about alternative currencies, guaranteed job complex. I know in the work of Michel, like he's been leaning a lot on, commonification as a kind of retaking of urban public services, from food to internet access, let's say, or the knowledge commons and open access, open source movements and such. And for example, community wealth building as a kind of upcoming concept that I suppose takes on its own particular look in terms of the potentialities of transforming political economy, also in relation to state, also in relation to new finance institutions, but at the same time, looking closely at the potentials and pitfalls of such strategies. So and yeah, I wouldn't say that any like kind of it's a lot of implicit notions about change, that there's no kind of a synthesis to be had, but still these decolonizing imaginaries, developing alternative imaginaries through these movements, has seemed to be a kind of conscious projects, and not just in sciences and activism, but also in the arts, of course, as a kind of way to opening up. I haven't seen, for example, and there are probably particular reasons why this is so, but we can't say of any very salient, utopian, imaginary, inspiring film project or art movement that kind of creates, you could say, pre-experiences of alternatives as a way of fabricating political moments or inertia or things of that nature. So, maybe if you have some reflections on that, and maybe also the power of art in this kind of political moment context.
Okay, that's a lot. So I wanted to first say one last thing for Michel, which is when I'm talking about a political moment, I don't want to sound like Hannah Arendt that thinks that who says that there needs to be some separate sphere of political activity. I'm talking about putting politics and democracy into the sort of efforts that both of you are talking about. So I don't want to make it sound like, because you end up not that this was Hannah Arendt's view, you end up with some idea of some separate state or specialized apparatus or moments that would be separate from all of the practices that people have in their everyday lives. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about questioning you guys about this idea that we can't have something central, or that there can't be a democracy that works as an articulation of all social institutions that could include a direct democratic component, as opposed to the libertarian idea that it's just you're going to find the technical means by which you're going to avoid all human messy problems. So
we're on your side. I just want to say that we're on your side in this debate. You know,
okay, so if I'm helpful, that's great. On degrowth first, it's interesting. Castoriadis, as I mentioned, was the director of National Accounts and Growth Studies, so he was very aware of growth as an ideology, and he has a wonderful paper on reflections on rationality and development. Rationality is in quotation marks because he saw this destruction of meaning through rationalization, but also development. The idea that one had that we could export growth to other areas of the world. There was Walt Rostow's idea that it was like an airplane that was going to take off, and the African countries too would be able to, I guess, no longer be connected to their land through growth, that somehow was going to get up there, and then that was a good thing, and so on. But degrowth, which Serge Latouche and others who are very familiar with Castoriadis's work, I'm not really convinced that that is a coherent starting point, because what is growth? I can't go into all of that here, but Castoriadis has a critique of the idea that all of these heterogeneous things that are products and practices and so on and so forth could ever be put together in growth that then one would just simply degrow. Now, obviously, there's more to it, but as a concept, degrowth, I've never been convinced by. You have mentioned in your writing to me in advance, and then here, the idea of narratives and the end of grand narratives and so on. Not everything is a narrative. Everything today is being portrayed as a narrative, but that's just not the case. I think it's much more important to be talking in terms of social imaginary institutions and social imaginary significations, and that is directly related to values that would animate organizations. And I'm not convinced that just doing it on the local level or having connections using existing technologies actually creates new significations, new forms of organization that would be democratic, would have this political momentum in the way that I'm talking about. I don't know what decolonizing the imaginary is. You followed that up by saying, and creating other imaginaries, and so I'd say yes. So I'm not sure what I can say, but more specifically about basic income and guaranteed jobs, that's all within the existing system at a point where society is starting to realize that it's not going to have a job for everyone, that we actually do have a lot of productivity and growth and all of these other sorts of previously wonderful things. Just having a guaranteed job doesn't guarantee that you have a say about your job. Having a basic income doesn't mean that you have a say about the distribution of the social product. This is what Castoriadis' ideas on the content of socialism, 1957, bringing in a technical computer aspect to it, were all about, that it's still a sort of consumer idea, well, everyone will have an income. Well, who determines what incomes are? Well, we will have the state come in perhaps and mandate this, and perhaps that's even going to be necessary. That capitalism capitalism will decide that this is necessary, because they can't employ all people and they can't afford to just leave people out in the cold. And we're seeing with the pandemic ways in which that is starting to change a little bit, but it doesn't have a democratic idea that there are people that work or that do other things for society that are collectively working together and making determinations about how the product is divided. So I've never been very convinced by basic income or guaranteed jobs. But at the same time, you mentioned the word utopia, and this is something that Castoriadis was very adamant about, was that his ideas are not utopian. He's trying to elucidate people's actual responses and reactions within the world that we have today, with all of the technological marvels and disasters that we have, that to try to figure out what are we creating today that can help to foster new forms of social organization and new significations, meaning basically values, at a time where the rationalization of everything is leading to the destruction of all values, destruction of initiative, destruction of responsibility. And in some of the people that you are dealing with or debating with, there is the, from what I'm hearing, almost the infinite degree of that hatred of politics, that hatred of having human values and significations put at the center of things, and to somehow create the technical conditions whereby those things are, because they're messy and can't have automatic solutions, or even, as Michel was saying, models. We don't need more economic models, either the communist, socialist, classical one, or the capitalist model. That's how economists always talk. We need to destroy the economic as a separate area of social life, and have not just in a conservative idea, oh, we have to have values back or something like that, but what values do we want as a society, and is society capable of wanting itself? This is something that that just at the same time he was writing about privatization, depoliticization, he was also questioning, does society want itself, and what does society want itself as? Those are the big questions. How do we put that into practices where people are themselves the agents of asking those questions and providing responses, not final solutions to it, not models that we are then all going to follow, but having those sort of values, with the value of autonomy as a project being at the center.
Thanks for that. Just a bit
It's a
of
good moment to conclude, actually, because we've been talking quite some time already. I think that was actually a very good conclusion.
Didn't say anything about the power of art, which is probably more important than all of the other things. So I'm really glad that Rock brought that up. My other another hat that I wear besides Agra International and as a translator, and hopefully seeing this this exchange, which is much better than me playing some sort of role of expert or something like that. I hope this will give people desire to take a look at the paper that I've written, because I can't summarize everything in just a few words here. But the power of art, my other hat is I work as administrator with my spouse, who's a dancer choreographer, Clara Gibson Maxwell. And so we've been trying to explore some of Castoriadis's ideas and do that through multi-arts, site responsive performances that involve the sometimes ambulatory, that involve the public to experience what the explorations are in the performance and the themes of the performance in such a way that there'll then be a dialogue afterwards between artists and the public. And so we try to exemplify there through art some of these issues that we've been talking about here. So I think the power of art is a wonderful aspect of this, because that is deeper than philosophy, deeper than politics. This is, as Castoriadis says, a window on the chaos of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, just a bit of a clarification. I think
Sure.
like when we discussed with our guest, notions of basic income and such, we've pretty much always been quite critical, more or less, for the same reasons that you've outlined. But at the same time, I think one of the ideas of the Spiders platform has been to kind of offer or juxtapose these different proposals at different layers, self-reflexive and critical to different degrees, or seeing themselves kind of fit within this kind of a project of transformation, and also at different scales and in different contexts and such. And I think, yeah, your contribution specifically has been in quite a specific arena in this kind of constellation, and I've personally taken it, right, as a kind of step back and rethink some very basic premises about society, the imaginaries, change itself, and such.
Well, for me, the question is, in an earlier, just to put it in historical perspective, in an earlier period, there were various the utopian socialists that had a sort of technocratic or affinity-based view, depending upon which utopian socialist there was, but also guild socialism was another historic attempt to do an end run around the growing industrial capitalism. But can you create something that is separate from the system while you're still in the system? And how much, and this is a question of reflection rather than I've got the answers, how much are we still reproducing the existing system when we think we are against it? Marx thought that he had come up with the way to get beyond it. And in fact, at least if you accept Castoriadis' point of view, he had fully adopted the capitalist imaginary and was the means by which it was introduced into the working class. So we want change. We'd like to see change, and to what extent are we, through our social imaginary of the existing society, reproducing that even when we are opposing it? And that's why, getting back to the very beginning, with talking about where Castoriadis came from, he was already in Greece asking those sorts of questions.
Okay, thank you. Rob, do you want to
It was
conclude?
a great pleasure to talk to you guys.
Yeah, it was. I think it was a very lively and warm conversation, and I think one of the better ones in terms of this kind of energy. So I think people will like it. Well, I hope I have the right judgment on this. We'll see. But yeah, it was really pleasant.
Yeah, and I don't want to ever seem like I'm just raining on anyone's parade or just engaged in fault finding for nitpicking or anything like that. But to the extent that I have had an experience that I can share with others that leads to some further reflections for you guys to take to go the way that you think that this needs to go. If I've been helpful, I feel glad about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.